Daniel Cole had never been anyone's first choice for anything. His supervisors back on Earth had called him too quiet, too passive, too willing to listen when he should have been talking. So when the assignment came through for Outpost Meridian, a tiny station at the edge of nowhere, Daniel understood the message clearly. They wanted him gone from the important work. He stood at the viewport of the transport shuttle and watched the station grow larger against the black emptiness of space. It was a small thing, barely larger than a cargo freighter, spinning slowly to create gravity for the 100 or so humans who lived and worked there. Beyond it, the stars stretched on forever, and somewhere out there, the Dominion was expanding its territory one conquered system at a time. The shuttle docked with a gentle thump, and Daniel gathered his single bag of belongings. He did not need much: books on alien cultures, a tablet filled with linguistic databases, a small wooden box that held a photograph of his grandmother, the woman who had taught him that listening was its own kind of strength. Commander Lisa Perry met him at the airlock. She was a tall woman with short gray hair and eyes that had seen too many conflicts. She shook his hand once firmly, and then led him through the narrow corridors of the station without small talk. "I'll be honest with you, Cole," she said as they walked. "I asked for a military negotiator, someone with combat experience, someone that might actually respect. And they sent me instead," Daniel said. "They sent you instead." Perry stopped at a door marked with the symbol for the diplomatic office. It was a small room, barely large enough for a desk and 2 chairs. "The delegation arrives in 3 days. Their chief, a warrior named, has agreed to discuss territorial boundaries, but I've dealt with before. They don't discuss. They take. And they only stop taking when someone makes them." Daniel set his bag down and looked around the tiny office. "Tell me about them." Perry leaned against the doorframe and crossed her arms. "They're reptilian, average height around 2.5 meters. They evolved on a high-gravity world, so they're stronger than us, faster than us, and they know it. Their entire society is built around combat. Trial by battle settles everything from property disputes to marriages. The strong rule, the weak serve, and anyone who can't fight is barely worth noticing." "And they see humans as weak," Daniel said. "They see humans as prey." Perry's voice was flat and hard. "We've had 3 mining colonies raided in the past year, 47 dead. They don't even consider it war. To them, it's just harvesting resources from creatures too pathetic to stop them." Daniel nodded slowly. He had read the reports during his journey. They were not evil in the way humans understood evil. They simply operated by different rules. In their world, weakness was a moral failing, and the strong had every right to take from those who could not defend themselves. "I need access to everything you have on their culture," Daniel said. "Historical records, linguistic analyses, anthropological studies, everything." Perry raised an eyebrow, planning to bore them into submission. "Planning to understand them." Daniel sat down at the desk and activated the computer terminal. "You can't negotiate with someone if you don't know what they value." The commander watched him for a long moment, then shrugged. "I'll have the files sent to your terminal, but Cole, I want you to understand something. If these talks fail, we go to war, and we will lose. We don't have the ships or the soldiers to fight the head-on, so whatever you're planning, it better work." She left without waiting for a response. Daniel spent the next 3 days reading. He barely slept, barely ate, and spoke to almost no one. The other station personnel whispered about him, the strange, quiet diplomat who had locked himself away with his books while everyone else prepared for the worst. He learned that they had ruled their region of space for over 2,000 years. He learned that their chieftains carried ceremonial spears that symbolized their authority, weapons passed down through generations of combat and conquest. He learned that honor to the was not about morality, but about strength demonstrated through action. And he learned about the old ways, ancient rituals that predated the expansion into space, trials and challenges that had governed their society before they developed starships and plasma weapons. Most of these traditions had faded over the centuries, but they still existed in the cultural memory. They still carried weight. Tessa Grant, the stations, found him on the morning of the third day. She was young, barely out of university, with red hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and tired eyes that suggested she had been working as hard as he had. "The ship just dropped out of hyperspace," she said. "They'll be docking in 4 hours." Daniel looked up from his tablet. "Have you studied their insult terminology?" Tessa blinked. "Their what?" They have over 300 specific terms for expressing contempt. Each one carries different weight and implies different things about the speaker and the target. If we're going to survive these negotiations, I need to know exactly what they're saying about us." The young linguist stared at him for a moment, then slowly smiled. "You're not what I expected." "No one ever expects the quiet ones." Daniel stood and stretched muscles that had been still for too long. "Walk me through their honorific system. I want to know every way to address Chief and what each form of address implies." They worked together for the remaining hours, and by the time the warship appeared in the viewport, Daniel felt as prepared as he would ever be. The ship was massive, a brutal thing of dark metal and sharp angles, designed to intimidate as much as to fight. It dwarfed Outpost Meridian the way a wolf might dwarf a rabbit. Commander Perry assembled a small, welcoming party at the main airlock. Daniel stood at the back, watching as the doors opened and the delegation stepped through. Chief was everything the reports had described and more. He stood nearly 3 meters tall, his scaled skin a deep green that shifted to black along his spine. His eyes were golden and slitted, and they swept across the assembled humans with obvious disdain. In his right hand, he carried a spear that gleamed with age and careful maintenance, the weapon of his ancestors, the symbol of his authority. Behind him came 6 warriors, each one armed and armored, each one looking at the humans the way a predator might look at particularly uninteresting prey. Spoke, and his voice was like gravel scraping against stone. Tessa translated quietly in Daniel's ear. "He says he is here to discuss which systems will belong to thee, and which scraps they might allow the prey things to keep." Perry's jaw tightened, but she kept her voice steady. "Welcome to Outpost Meridian, Chief. I am Commander Lisa Perry. We are honored by your presence." His eyes moved across the welcoming party and stopped on Daniel. The chief studied him for a long moment, then spoke again. "He wants to know why you are staring at him," Tessa whispered. Daniel did not look away. "Tell him I am trying to see the warrior behind the contempt. I have heard they were once a great people. I am curious if any of that greatness remains." Tessa hesitated. "Are you sure?" "Tell him." She did, and for the first time since stepping onto the station, Chief smiled. It was not a pleasant expression. "He says he will enjoy teaching you what greatness looks like," Tessa translated. "He says he will begin by finding a warrior to speak for humanity, a real warrior, not a soft-skinned talker who hides behind words." The negotiations had not even begun, and already Daniel could feel everyone watching him, waiting for him to fail, waiting for proof that Earth had sent the wrong man. Daniel simply nodded and said nothing. He had expected exactly this. The real work was about to begin. The first negotiation session was a disaster. They gathered in the station's largest meeting room, a space barely adequate for the massive warriors who filled it with their presence and their contempt. Commander Perry sat at one end of the table with Daniel and Tessa beside her. Chief sat at the other end, his spear resting against the wall behind him like a silent threat. Daniel had prepared opening remarks. He had written them carefully, using phrases that his research suggested might appeal to sensibilities. He spoke of mutual benefit, of boundaries that could serve both species, of a future where strength could be measured in prosperity rather than conquest. Let him finish. Then the chief turned to his warriors and said something that made them all laugh. It was an ugly sound, harsh and mocking, and it filled the room like smoke. "He called you a grass-eater," Tessa whispered, her face pale. "It means prey animal, something that exists only to be consumed by predators." Daniel nodded calmly. "What else?" "He said your words are like the bleating of livestock, noise without meaning." Tessa's hands were shaking slightly as she translated. "He says humans have no warriors, only farmers and cowards who hide behind metal walls." Perry's face had gone red with suppressed anger. "We have a fleet," she said through clenched teeth. "We have soldiers. We could make them pay for every system they try to take." Seemed to understand her tone even without translation. He leaned forward and spoke directly to her, his golden eyes gleaming with something that might have been anticipation. "He says he hopes you will try to fight," Tessa translated. "He says his warriors grow bored with easy prey. A little resistance might make the conquest more entertaining." The session ended shortly after that. Perry stormed out, and the warriors returned to their ship laughing among themselves. Daniel stayed behind, sitting alone in the empty meeting room thinking. Tessa found him there an hour later. "The commander wants to see you." "I know. She's talking about calling for military reinforcement. She thinks the negotiations are hopeless." Daniel looked up at the young linguist. "What do you think?" Tessa sat down across from him. "I think they don't see this as a negotiation at all. To them, it's a formality. They're going through the motions because some part of their honor code requires them to offer terms before taking what they want. But they've already decided we have nothing to offer, because we haven't shown them anything worth respecting." "Exactly," Tessa leaned forward. "In society, words only matter when they come from someone who has proven their worth through action. A warrior's promise carries weight because a warrior has demonstrated strength. A priest's blessing matters because a priest has endured the trials of their order. But a stranger's words, they're meaningless, less than meaningless." Daniel nodded slowly. "So we need to show them something. We need to show them someone." The next 3 sessions followed the same pattern. Daniel would speak and would mock him. The chief had an endless supply of insults, each one more creative than the last. He called Daniel weak blood and soft meat and shadow walker, a term that implied someone too cowardly to stand in the light. His warriors took up the mockery with enthusiasm, deliberately turning their backs when Daniel spoke, talking among themselves as if he were not even present. Perry grew more frustrated with each passing day. She began keeping armed guards outside the meeting room, a gesture that only seemed to amuse the further. "They want us to attack," she said during a late-night strategy session. "They're trying to provoke us into doing something stupid so they can claim self-defense when they wipe us out." "They're testing us," Daniel agreed, "but not the way you think." "Explain." Daniel stood and walked to the viewport. Outside, the warship hung in space like a predator waiting for the right moment to strike. "They don't want war," he said quietly. "War is expensive. It costs ships and warriors and resources. What they want is submission. They want us to accept our place as prey, to hand over what they want without forcing them to spend anything taking it. And if we don't submit, then they'll take it anyway, but if we fight, we lose, and if we submit, we lose everything." Daniel turned back to face the commander. "There's a third option." Perry raised an eyebrow. "I'm listening." "We make them see us differently. Not as prey, not as enemies, but as something else entirely. Something their culture has a framework for but hasn't encountered in a long time." "And what exactly is that?" Daniel was quiet for a moment. "Equals." The next session, Daniel did something unexpected. When began his usual mockery, Daniel did not simply accept it. Instead, he stood and addressed the chief directly, using a formal construction that Tessa had taught him, one that demanded a response. "I ask the great chief," Daniel said in halting but precise, "if he has ever lost." The room went silent. Warriors stopped laughing. The chief himself leaned back in his seat, his golden eyes narrowing with sudden interest. "He asks what you mean," Tessa whispered, though Daniel had understood the response himself. "Every warrior loses eventually," Daniel continued in. "Every chief faces a moment when strength alone is not enough. I ask if the great has known such a moment." The chief was quiet for a long time. Then he spoke, and his voice was different than before, softer, more thoughtful. "He says yes," Tessa translated. "He says there was a battle many years ago when he was young. He faced an enemy he could not defeat through strength. He was wounded here." She gestured to her left side. "He survived only because he learned to think differently, to fight with his mind as well as his body." Daniel nodded. "I ask the great chief to think differently now. I ask him to consider that humans might have something to offer besides easy prey." Studied him for a long moment. Then the chief smiled, that unpleasant smile again, but this time there was something else behind it, something that might have been respect. "He says words are still only words," Tessa translated, "but he admits you speak them better than before. He says if you want him to see humans as something other than prey, you will need to show him. Through action, through the old ways." Daniel felt his heart beating faster. This was the opening he had been waiting for. This was the crack in the wall. "Ask him," Daniel said, "if he remembers the right of contested honor." The reaction was immediate. Warriors exchanged glances, and the chief himself went very still. The right was ancient, almost forgotten. No one had invoked it in generations. But it still existed in the cultural memory. It still carried weight. Spoke, and this time he addressed Daniel as something other than prey. "He asks if you understand what you are suggesting," Tessa said, her voice barely above a whisper. "He asks if you know what the right demands." Daniel met the chief's golden eyes and did not look away. "I know." "He says you will suffer." "I know." "He says you might die." "I know." Was silent for another long moment. Then he stood, and his warriors stood with him. The chief crossed the room until he was standing directly in front of Daniel, towering over the human by nearly a full meter. Then did something that shocked everyone in the room. He inclined his head, just slightly, just enough to acknowledge that something had changed. "He accepts," Tessa breathed. "The right will begin at dawn." Daniel Cole had just volunteered for an ordeal that might kill him, and for the first time since arriving at Outpost Meridian, he felt like he might actually accomplish something. The mockery was about to end. Commander Perry caught up with Daniel before he could reach his quarters. She grabbed his arm and spun him around, her eyes blazing with a mixture of anger and fear. "What the hell did you just do?" Daniel gently removed her hand from his arm. "I invoked the right of contested honor. It's an ancient tradition for settling disputes between unequal parties. 3 trials, if I complete them, is bound by his own culture to treat humanity as worthy of respect. And if you fail, then nothing changes. They take what they want and we either submit or die fighting." Daniel shrugged. "At least this way there's a chance." Perry shook her head. "You're not a soldier, Cole, you're a diplomat. You read books and write reports. Those trials, whatever they are, they're designed for warriors, beings who are stronger, faster, and tougher than any human." "The right was designed for exactly this situation," Daniel said calmly. "For disputes between parties of unequal strength. The trials test endurance, will, and decisive action. They don't require me to be stronger than they require me to prove that I'm willing to suffer for what I believe in." "And you are willing to suffer." Daniel thought about the mining colonies that had been raided, 47 dead, families destroyed, lives ended because humanity was seen as prey, as livestock to be harvested. "Yes," he said simply, "I am." Tessa found him in his quarters an hour later. He was sitting on his bunk, reading through ancient texts on his tablet, preparing for what was to come. "I've been researching the trials," she said, sitting down beside him. The first one is called the Walk of Burning Stones. The challenger crosses a path of heated metal plates. They use it as a coming-of-age ritual. Young warriors who complete it earn the right to carry weapons. Daniel nodded. I know. The second trial is the test of will. The challenger stands in a marked circle while warriors strike them with ceremonial rods. The goal isn't to avoid pain. It's to refuse to move, to yield ground, to prove that nothing can make you retreat. I know. Tessa's voice grew quieter. The third trial is called the trial of decisive action. It's combat, Daniel. Single combat against the one who accepted the challenge. Against himself. Daniel set down his tablet and looked at her. I know all of this, Tessa. I've known since before I invoked the right. Then why? She shook her head in confusion. You can't beat in a fight. He's twice your size and has been training for combat since he could walk. Even if you survive the first two trials, the third one will kill you. Maybe. Daniel stood and walked to the small porthole that looked out into space. But the right isn't about winning through strength. It never was. The ancients who designed it understood something that modern have forgotten. They understood that true worth isn't measured by how hard you can hit, but by what you're willing to endure for what matters. That's a nice philosophy. It won't stop from putting his spear through your chest. Daniel turned back to face her. The combat doesn't have to end in death. According to the old texts, it ends when one party yields, when one party is unable to continue, or when one party demonstrates decisive action that resolves the underlying dispute. What does that even mean? I don't know yet, Daniel smiled slightly. I'm hoping I'll figure it out before I have to find out. The morning came too quickly. Daniel had not slept. He had spent the night reading, thinking, and preparing himself mentally for what was to come. As the station's artificial lights slowly brightened to simulate dawn, he dressed in simple clothing and made his way to the cargo bay that had been cleared for the trials. They were already there. All 6 warriors stood in a circle around the edges of the bay, their scaled faces unreadable. In the center of the space, a path of metal plates had been laid out, each one glowing faintly red with heat. At the far end of the path, Chief waited, his ceremonial spear planted in the deck beside him. Commander Perry and a handful of station personnel watched from the observation gallery above. Tessa stood near the door, her face pale with worry. Spoke and his voice echoed through the bay. He's explaining the rules, Tessa called out. You must walk the path without assistance. You cannot run, you cannot stop. If you fall or leave the path before reaching the end, you fail. Do you understand? Daniel nodded. Spoke again. He asks if you wish to withdraw. There is no shame in recognizing your limitations. Daniel looked at the glowing plates. Even from here, he could feel the heat radiating from them. This was going to hurt more than anything he had ever experienced. Tell him I understand my limitations better than he knows, Daniel said. Tell him that's exactly why I'm here. Tessa translated, and something flickered in his golden eyes. Then the chief stepped aside and gestured toward the path. Daniel removed his shoes. There was no point in ruining them, and the thin material would offer no protection anyway. He stood at the beginning of the path and took a deep breath. Then he began to walk. The pain was immediate and overwhelming. It shot up through his feet and into his legs like lightning, like fire, like nothing he had ever felt before. Every instinct in his body screamed at him to stop, to run, to get away from the source of the agony. He kept walking. The warriors watched in silence. His expression had shifted from contempt to something else. Interest, perhaps, or confusion. Humans were soft creatures, weak things that fled from pain. This one was not fleeing. Daniel focused on his breathing. In through the nose, out through the mouth, one step at a time. The world narrowed to the next plate, the next moment, the next breath. The pain was still there, still overwhelming, but he had pushed it to the side of his awareness. It was happening to his body, but it did not control his mind. Halfway, the metal plates seemed to stretch out forever in front of him, an endless path of suffering. He could smell something burning and realized with distant horror that it was his own flesh. His feet were blistering, the skin breaking down under the relentless heat. He kept walking. The warriors had stopped moving entirely. They stood like statues, watching this strange human who refused to scream, refused to run, refused to do anything except continue forward one agonizing step at a time. 3/4 of the way, Daniel stumbled slightly, his balance wavering as his damaged feet struggled to support him. For a moment he thought he might fall. If he fell, it was over. The trial would end in failure, and everything he had endured would mean nothing. He steadied himself and kept walking. The last few steps were the hardest. His vision had gone gray around the edges, and he could feel his body trying to shut down, trying to protect itself from the damage being inflicted upon it. But Daniel had spent his whole life being told he was too quiet, too passive, too willing to accept his place. Not today. He stepped off the final plate and collapsed to his knees on the cool metal deck beyond. His feet were ruined, covered in burns and blisters, some of the skin blackened and peeling. The pain was a living thing, a monster that consumed his entire awareness. But he had finished. He had not cried out. He had not fled. He had walked the path from beginning to end, just as countless warriors had done before him. Approached slowly. The chief looked down at the human kneeling before him, at the damaged feet and the sweat-soaked clothing, and the face that showed pain but not defeat. Then spoke a single word. Tessa's voice came from across the bay, filled with wonder. He said acceptable. Daniel, he accepted the trial. You passed. The warriors were not laughing anymore. They were looking at Daniel with something new in their eyes, something that had not been there before. It was not respect, not yet. But it was the beginning of recognition. And Daniel Cole, despite the agony that consumed his body, allowed himself a small moment of hope. 2 trials remained. The station's medical officer wanted to keep Daniel in the infirmary for a week. His feet were badly burned and the risk of infection was serious. He needed rest, treatment, and time to heal. Daniel refused. The second trial begins at noon, he told the doctor, a gray-haired woman named Carol who had seen her share of injuries during her time on the frontier. If I'm not there, I forfeit. Everything I went through this morning becomes meaningless. Doctor shook her head. You can barely stand. Walking on those feet will cause permanent damage. Then I'll deal with permanent damage. Daniel swung his legs off the medical bed and tested his weight. The pain was extraordinary, a sharp reminder of what he had already endured. But pain was just information. It told him something was wrong. It did not have to control him. Tessa helped him wrap his feet in fresh bandages. The material would offer some protection, though not much. She worked in silence, her face troubled. You don't have to do this, she said quietly. The first trial impressed them. Maybe would be willing to negotiate now. He wouldn't. Daniel stood carefully, letting his body adjust to the new reality of his damaged feet. The don't respect half measures. If I stop now, they'll see it as proof that humans quit when things get difficult. Every negotiation from this point forward will be colored by that perception. And if the second trial kills you? Daniel looked at her. Then at least I'll have shown them that some humans don't quit. That might be worth something to the next diplomat who has to deal with them. The cargo bay had been reconfigured for the test of will. A circle about 2 meters in diameter had been painted on the deck in red, and the warriors stood around it holding long ceremonial rods made of some kind of dense wood. Waited at the edge of the circle, his spear in hand. When Daniel limped into the bay, the chief studied him with those golden eyes, taking in the bandaged feet and the careful way he moved. He asks if you are certain you wish to continue, Tessa translated. He says you have already proven more than he expected. There would be honor in recognizing your limits. Daniel stepped into the circle. Tell him I appreciate the offer, but I came here to finish what I started. Nodded slowly, and something that might have been approval flickered across his scaled face. Then he spoke to his warriors, and they raised their rods. The rules were simple. Daniel had to remain in the circle while they struck him with their rods. He could not leave the circle. He could not fall. He could not yield. The trial would continue until declared it complete. The first blow caught Daniel across the shoulders. It was not a gentle tap. The warrior who delivered it put real force behind the strike, and Daniel felt something crack in his back. A rib, maybe, or just the sound of his body protesting this latest abuse. He stayed on his feet. He stayed in the circle. The second blow came from a different direction, catching him across the thighs. The third struck his arms. The fourth hit him in the chest so hard that the air was driven from his lungs and he doubled over, gasping. But he did not step back. He did not leave the circle. The blows continued. The warriors moved around him in a slow rotation, each one taking their turn. They struck his legs, his arms, his torso, his back. They avoided his head, which Daniel understood was a small mercy built into the ritual, but every other part of his body was fair game. 10 minutes passed. 20. Daniel lost count of the blows. His body was a map of pain, each new strike adding another landmark to the geography of his suffering. Blood ran from cuts where the rods had broken skin. Bruises bloomed across his flesh like dark flowers. They had stopped talking among themselves. They watched the human in the circle with something that had moved beyond surprise into genuine wonder. This creature was weak, fragile, easily broken, and yet he would not move. He would not yield. 30 minutes. 40. Daniel's vision had narrowed to a small tunnel of light surrounded by darkness. He could feel his body failing, systems shutting down one by one as the damage accumulated. But his feet remained planted in the circle, and his mind remained focused on that single fact. He would not move. One of the warriors struck him particularly hard across the lower back, and Daniel felt his legs buckle. He fell to one knee, barely catching himself before he collapsed completely. The warriors paused, waiting to see if he would stay down. Daniel grabbed his own leg with trembling hands and forced himself back upright. It took everything he had, every last reserve of strength and will, but he stood. The warrior who had struck him stepped back, and Daniel saw something new in the alien's eyes. Not contempt, not mockery. Fear. They were afraid of him. This small, soft creature who should have broken long ago. This impossible being who absorbed punishment that would have made warriors twice his size retreat. Raised his hand, and the warriors stopped. The chief walked into the circle and stood before Daniel. Up close, the damage was even more apparent. The human was covered in blood and bruises, swaying on his feet, barely conscious, and yet his eyes remained clear and focused. Spoke, and his voice was different than before, softer, respectful. He says the trial is complete, Tessa translated, her own voice thick with emotion. He says he has never seen anything like what you just did. He calls you Ironbone. He calls you Woundwalker. He says these are names of honor among his people. Daniel tried to speak, but his voice came out as a croak. He swallowed and tried again. What about the third trial? His eyes widened slightly. Even now, after everything, the human was asking about what came next, not pleading for mercy, not asking to be released from his commitment, but pushing forward. The chief spoke again. He offers to end the right here, Tessa said. He says you have proven enough. He is willing to negotiate as equals to treat humanity with respect. You do not need to face the third trial. Daniel was quiet for a long moment. Every part of his body screamed at him to accept, to take the victory and walk away. He had done what he came to do. He had changed how they saw humanity. But there was still a trial remaining, and if he stopped now, Some part of them would always wonder. Some part of them would always question whether humans could truly go the distance. "Tell him no," Daniel said. "Tell him I appreciate the offer, but the rite has 3 trials. I will complete all 3. Tessa stared at him. "Daniel, you can barely stand. The 3rd trial is combat, combat against himself." "I know what it is." Daniel met the chief's golden eyes. "Tell him." She did, and his response was unlike anything that had come before. The chief reached out and placed his hand on Daniel's shoulder. It was a gesture of respect among an acknowledgement between equals, then spoke words that made even his own warriors gasp. "He says you are either the bravest being he has ever met or the most foolish," Tessa translated. "He says he hopes you are the former. He says he will give you 1 night to prepare. The 3rd trial will begin at dawn." Daniel nodded. "Tell him I'll be ready." Held his gaze for a moment longer, then turned and led his warriors from the cargo bay. Daniel stood alone in the circle, surrounded by his own blood, his body broken in a dozen ways. Tomorrow he would face a warrior chief in single combat, a being faster and stronger and more skilled than he could ever hope to be. But for the first time since the negotiations began, Daniel did not feel like prey. He felt like a warrior. And warriors did not quit. Daniel spent the night not sleeping but thinking. Doctor had done what she could for his injuries, wrapping his torso in bandages, treating the worst of his cuts, giving him medications that dulled the pain without clouding his mind. But there was no treatment for what he was about to face. No medicine that could make him strong enough to defeat in single combat. So he thought about something else instead. He thought about the broken spear. The ceremonial weapon that carried was ancient, passed down through generations of chieftains. It represented authority, power, the right to rule. Every chief who had carried it had earned that honor through combat, through strength, through the old ways. But the spear was also more than a weapon. It was a symbol of continuity, a connection between past and present, a reminder that even the mightiest warrior was part of something larger than himself. Daniel thought about what it would mean if that spear broke. Morning came, and with it, the final trial. The cargo bay had been cleared completely this time. No circles, no heated plates, no warriors with rods. Just an open space with standing at one end, his spear in his hands and Daniel standing at the other. The entire station had gathered in the observation gallery. Commander Perry stood with her arms crossed, her face grim. Tessa watched with tears in her eyes, certain she was about to witness the death of a man she had come to respect. Even Doctor was there, her medical kit ready for what she knew would be a futile attempt at treatment. Spoke, and his voice filled the bay. "He explains the rules," Tessa called down. "The trial ends when one party yields, when one party cannot continue, or when one party demonstrates decisive action that resolves the dispute. He asks if you understand." Daniel nodded. "I understand." Tossed a second spear across the bay. It clattered to the deck at Daniel's feet, a weapon identical to the chief's own. The message was clear. This would be a fair fight. Equal weapons, equal footing. At least in theory. Daniel picked up the spear. It was heavier than he expected, designed for hands much larger than his own. He adjusted his grip and faced across the empty space. The chief did not rush forward. He moved slowly, almost casually, circling Daniel like a predator sizing up prey. His golden eyes tracked every movement, every shift of weight, every flicker of uncertainty. Daniel circled too, keeping the distance between them constant. He knew he could not match in strength or speed. A direct confrontation would end quickly and badly. His only chance was to wait for an opening, to find some weakness he could exploit. The old wound. Daniel had noticed it during the negotiations. Favored his left side, protecting an injury that had never fully healed. The chief had mentioned it himself during their first real conversation, that battle long ago when he had learned to fight with his mind as well as his body. Daniel shifted his movement, drifting to his left. The chief adjusted immediately, turning to keep Daniel in front of him, but the movement was slightly slower on that side, slightly more guarded. Strug. The attack was blindingly fast, a thrust aimed at Daniel's chest that would have ended the fight instantly if it had connected. Daniel threw himself to the side, barely avoiding and scrambled to regain his footing. The chief pressed forward, not giving Daniel time to recover. A sweep aimed at his legs, a thrust at his throat, a spinning strike that whistled through the air where his head had been a moment before. Daniel retreated, dodged, his damaged feet screaming with every movement. He was outclassed. He knew it. Everyone watching knew it. Was playing with him, testing his defenses, learning his patterns before delivering the killing blow. But Daniel had learned something too. Was holding back, not out of mercy, but out of habit. The chief had fought so many opponents who relied on strength against strength that he had forgotten how to fight someone who refused to engage directly. Daniel stopped retreating. Instead, he moved forward, inside reach, too close for the spear to be used effectively. It was a desperate gamble, putting himself within arm's length of a being who could crush him with bare hands. But it also put him on his weak side. Daniel did not try to strike. He grabbed the shaft of spear with both hands and twisted, using his body weight rather than his strength. The technique was old, something humans had developed thousands of years ago for exactly this purpose. Leverage against a stronger opponent. Momentum redirected. Stumbled, caught off guard by the unexpected move. His grip on the spear loosened for just a moment. Daniel pulled. The spear came free, and the momentum sent both of them crashing to the deck. Landed on his back with Daniel on top of him, both hands gripping the ancient weapon. For one frozen moment, Daniel could have driven the spear down, could have ended the fight with a killing blow. Eyes met his, and Daniel saw something there he had not expected. Not fear, not anger. Anticipation. The chief wanted to know what Daniel would do, what choice the human would make when he held power over his enemy. Daniel made his choice. He drove the spear down with all his remaining strength, but not into the deck beside the chief's head. The ancient weapon struck the metal floor at an angle, and the shaft shattered under the impact. The spear that had been carried by generations of chieftains broke in half. The cargo bay went completely silent. The warrior stared in shock, even lay motionless, his golden eyes wide with something that might have been wonder. Daniel stood slowly, his body trembling with exhaustion. He bent down and picked up both halves of the broken spear. Then he knelt. He placed both pieces on the deck in front of and spoke in halting, words he had practiced through the night. A broken weapon can be reforged, stronger than before, but only if both halves are joined. Rose to his feet. He looked down at the broken spear, at the human who had defeated him through cunning rather than strength, at the choice Daniel had made when he could have chosen differently. Then the chief spoke, and his voice carried through the bay like thunder. Tessa's translation came through tears. He says you could have killed him. You won the combat fairly. The spear was yours by right. He asks why you broke it instead. Daniel looked up at the towering alien. Because I didn't come here to defeat I came here to find a way for humans and to stand together. Victory through dominance creates enemies. Victory through respect creates allies. Was silent for a long moment. Then he bent down and picked up the two pieces of his ancestral spear. He held them in his hands, studying the broken halves, and when he looked at Daniel again, his expression had changed completely. The chief spoke one final time. He accepts, Tessa whispered. He declares you blood brother of the first human to ever hold that title. He says the treaty will be signed today, not as an agreement between predator and prey, but as an alliance between equals. He says he will keep the broken spear in his chambers as a reminder of what he learned here. The warriors were not silent anymore. They were chanting something, a single word repeated over and over. Ironbone, Tessa translated, her voice filled with wonder. They're calling you Ironbone, a warrior's name, an honorable name. Daniel felt his legs give out, and he would have collapsed if had not caught him. The massive chief lowered the human gently to the deck, and when Daniel looked up, he saw something impossible in those golden eyes. Friendship. Rest now, Ironbone said in heavily accented but understandable English. You have fought enough. 1 month later, Daniel Cole stood at the viewport of Outpost Meridian and watched a warship depart. But this time, it was not leaving as a threat. It was leaving as an ally, the first joint patrol between human and vessels. Commander Perry came to stand beside him. Earth wants to give you a senior diplomatic position. You could have any posting you want. Daniel shook his head. I think I'll stay here. The frontier is where the real work happens. Perry smiled. I was hoping you'd say that. She started to leave, then paused. Cole, that thing you did with the spear, breaking it instead of using it, how did you know would respond the way he did? Daniel thought about the question for a moment. I didn't know for certain, but I understood something about that they had forgotten about themselves. They don't really want endless war. They want worthy opponents, worthy allies. They were testing us, waiting to see if humanity could be something more than prey. And we showed them. Daniel nodded, watching the warship grow smaller against the stars. We showed them that the strongest weapon isn't always the one that kills. Sometimes it's the one that builds. Sometimes it's the one that breaks. Perry was quiet for a moment. They mocked you. They did. And you laid down their chief's broken spear. Daniel smiled. That's one way to describe it. He turned away from the viewport and walked back into the station, where there was more work to be done. There were always more species to understand, more bridges to build, more walls to break through. And Daniel Cole, the quiet diplomat that no one had expected, was just getting started.